Hello everyone. Now in March 1919, the Belfast newsletter carried an article written by a demobilised veteran of the Great War, who, having just returned home, shared his impressions of how the city had changed during his absence at the front. Remarking on his vain search, quote, in all the old haunts for the cheery faces of pals who will never haunt them again, he now pondered whether the horrific toll in young men's lives that Belfast paid meant it could continue to, quote, supply her young men to go forth into the empire and bear the responsibility of Britain's and far-off lands as she had done in the past. However, he answered his own query with a definitive yes and stated, and I quote, anybody who has any doubts in the matter could not have seen the final of the Ulster Schools competition the other day. Rugby football is the nursery of empire builders, and a very flourishing nursery it is today in Ulster. I thought as I watched the boys waging their battle for the cup and noted the quality and keenness of their play, that this was perhaps the one thing the ancient Romans lacked. They had their public games, of course, and their gladiators, but what were they in comparison with this clean, manly, healthy sport? Under the circumstances, I think the next great power which endeavours to wipe out the British Empire will have the same experience as the last had, provided we're careful, of course, and keep one eye on the nursery. End quote. Now, of course, such rhetoric was rampant throughout both Britain and Ireland at the time. Our former soldier was repeating a well-worn Victorian conviction that through organised sport, children could be infused with the required attributes to enable them to face and overcome the myriad of challenges and evils possessed by the ever-changing modern industrial world. For our soldier friend then, sport's role in producing the next generation of eager empire builders was fundamental, and Ireland would remain a healthy breeding ground in that endeavour. Yet, by March 1919, the political and military struggle to attain independence from British rule was already underway in Southern Ireland. This Irish Revolution represented the tidal surge of waves of nationalist ideology, indoctrination, and activism that stretched back to the 1790s, but now crested violently in the years between 1916 and 1923. And this era is by far the most studied, debated, and dissected part of our modern Irish history. And explorations of the targeting and propagandizing of Irish children by various nationalist organisations in the years preceding the Irish Revolutionary period have been a rich vein of recent historical inquiry. Now, my two colleagues on this panel, Marnie Hay and Ruina Nikungal, are among those who have produced fascinating works on cultural and political nationalist appropriation of children throughout this time, as I'm sure their papers for this conference will amply demonstrate. Yet one aspect of all of this has been largely ignored, and that is the role that organised sport played. This omission, of course, is reflective of the limited historiography of youth and children's sport in Ireland generally. And the modest aim then of this paper is an attempt to readdress this balance. So, for the next few minutes, I wish to explore how sport, particularly native Gaelic games, was utilised in the attempts to inspire devotion to the nationalist ideal of a culturally and politically independent Ireland among children across the school grounds and playing fields of Ireland, while also assessing the influence of nationalist media propaganda in this whole endeavour. Now, as in Britain, the Victorian era witnessed the first widespread attempts to introduce formal or codified sports to children in Ireland. Of course, the island's educational institutions were crucial to this enterprise, as societal leaders increasingly looked to sport to project the values they wished to incubate among the youth. The arrival of formal sport in Irish education, however, now overlapped with the sweeping tide of the so-called Gaelic revival in Irish society at the end of the 19th century. The Gaelic revival was, in essence, a wide-ranging rediscovery, re-evaluation and reappreciation of Irish culture and history, which began to emerge in intellectual and popular circles from the 1880s and reached its zenith in the decade immediately preceding the Irish Revolutionary era. It represented Ireland's cultural backlash to the ever-encroaching Anglicisation of Irish life and society. In reaction, the Gaelic revival would stimulate among significant proportions of the Irish population strong adherence to the ideology of cultural nationalism. and for a smaller minority, it would sufficiently radicalise their political and cultural outlook to bring them to the front of the revolutionary struggle for independence. Now, naturally, the major sports of British origin, which had seeped into Irish education by this stage, symbolised to many nationalists another manifestation of Britain's increasing cultural supremacy of Irish life. However, the foundation of the Gaelic Athletic Association, or GA, in November 1884 proved to be a transformative moment in the history of Irish sport. It was established by McElligott, a teacher, journalist, and sports-obsessed nationalist who had become an early convert to the Irish revival movement. And the GA looked to preserve and promote native games, specifically the two field sports of hurling and Gaelic football, thereby erecting a kind of sporting barricade to Anglicisation. And its almost immediate success meant Gaelic games quickly became a hugely popular expression of Irish cultural uniqueness and identity from this point on. Now, a dedicated educationalist, Cusack was already a zealous convert to the cult of athleticism that, of course, pervaded the British and Irish elite education system at this time. And he articulated his own philosophy on sport's place in schooling as follows, and I quote, "In England, the physical education of pupils is carefully provided. When we consider the fierceness of the fight and the struggle for existence, which is ongoing at the present moment in all parts of the globe, the keenness of the competition for positions of life, we can hardly fail to appreciate the importance of physical training in the life of the man and to fix its proper place in his education." Yet this was a brand of athleticism crafted for an Irish nationalist audience, and the GAA was, of course, a natural bedfellow of the broader cultural revival movement now emerging. Its games rapidly took their place alongside the new enthusiasm for Gaelic language, Irish folklore, music, archaeology, and history as the major hallmarks of Ireland's Gaelic awakening or reawakening, which attempted to create or recreate a so-called Irish Ireland. However, the GAA as an organisation was actually slow to make concentrated efforts to infiltrate Gaelic games into the Irish education system, and really it was only from the first decade of the 20th century that many nationalist commentators began to articulate the crucial importance of trying to promote Gaelic games within Ireland's 500 predominantly Catholic-run secondary schools and approximately 60 elite colleges, which aped the English public school model. Now, as these institutions catered for the offspring of the middle and upper classes, they were seen as representing the training grounds for the future leaders of the Irish nation. So, by exposing their students to Gaelic games at the expense of imported British sports, nationalists believed another fundamental aspect of native culture could be cultivated among the rising generation. Now, cultural nationalists might have reasonably expected that institutions run by the likes of the Catholic Education Order, the Christian Brothers, to be particularly receptive to their efforts. After all, these schools put an emphasis on a nationalist Catholic education, which celebrated Irish history and heritage and endorsed the Irish language. However, the Christian Brothers often displayed antipathy, if not open hostility to Gaelic games, principally due to the Catholic Church's open enmity towards the GAA at this point. And much of this surrounded the alleged close links between the leadership of the association and revolutionary nationalist groups in Ireland, such as the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, throughout the early history of the GAA. Nevertheless, however, the growth of kindred cultural organisations inspired by the Gaelic revival, in particular the Gaelic League, which was founded to revive and promote the everyday use of the Irish language, this would now both facilitate and motivate the promotion of Gaelic games across the Irish education system. So, like their male counterparts, Irish girls were also being exposed to formal sport primarily through education, a process, of course, further stimulated by the increasing numbers of women gaining access to higher education in Ireland by the beginning of the 20th century. However, for nationalist women, sports like hockey were tainted with the brush of Anglicisation. So a nationalist female alternative was sought, and the Gaelic League duly supplied it. In 1904, members of its Keatings branch in Dublin drew up the first formal rules for a female version of hurling called camogie. By 1905, a national association was begun. And with hockey already entrenched as a sport of choice in Protestant girls' schools in Ireland, this camogie association fostered links with middle-class Catholic institutions. And for the next 60 years, camogie, especially in rural Ireland, would provide one of the few organised sports open to active female participation. Now, by the turn of the 20th century, the GAA had firmly established itself and embedded itself into the broader cultural nationalist movement. And perhaps the greatest illustration of this was a series of rules passed by the association between 1901 and 1905, effectively banning any of its members from partaking in what were now designated as foreign games. Now, this represented a practical application in the realm of sport of the cultural policy of de-Anglicisation, which had been publicly preached by Douglas Hyde, the founder of the Gaelic League, since 1892. And so the dogma of the Irish Ireland movement and the existence of these bans now supplied a powerful tool to those who wished to promote Gaelic games at the expense of all others. And in the next 20 years, what you'd see and what you'd witness in Ireland is a kind of ideological battle for supremacy, fought across the media, the school grounds and the sports fields of Ireland. And in this war between native and foreign games, children's sport will become a prominent battleground. So, for example, in Cavan Town, the establishment of a boys' soccer club there in 1908 led to intense and bitter debate within the local press. Reacting to the news, one contributor declared that, quote, the youth of Cavan are tainted with the deadly poison of Anglicism. Another denounced any boys that looked to soccer as, quote, empty-headed dandies, who have mixed so much with the British garrison that they believe the greatest luck that could have befallen them was to have been born Sassenach, i.e. born English. Now, if many Catholic schools still remained lukewarm in their support of Gaelic games, that accusation could certainly not be made against Scoil Aithne, a private school established in 1908 by Patrick Pearse, who of course would go on to lead the 1916 Easter Rising insurrection in Dublin against British rule, and whose whole career personified the evolution of cultural nationalist idealism into violent revolutionary activism in this whole period. Now, Scoil Aithne was seen by nationalists as a kind of Irish Ireland version of the elite Irish Catholic colleges. And in his wholehearted promotion of Gaelic games and other physical activity within the curriculum, Pearse again demonstrated the impact British athleticism was having on Irish educational thinking. He firmly believed that by nurturing their health and fitness, children could withstand the depravities and temptations of modern society. However, of course, this was an athleticism moulded for an Irish Ireland purpose. Though Pearse had little interest in the sport of hurling for its own sake, like many of his colleagues in the Gaelic League, he did view the game and its long mythical history as representing a present-day link to ancient Gaelic society. And so, in the 1909 edition of the Scoil Aithne magazine, he would write, and I quote, Wellington is credited with the dictum that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. I am certain when it comes to the question of Ireland winning battles in the future, her main reliance must be on her hurlers. Now, for zealous cultural nationalists like Pearse, the playing of Gaelic games, much like speaking Irish, studying Irish history and performing Irish theatre, were constant exhortations to his students that, in his own words, we have a country of our own. Nevertheless, in 1909, an editorial in the feminist Ban na hÉireann newspaper lamented that, and I quote, the constant neglect of the children has been the big mistake of all nationalist organisations. Now, echoing this, numerous cultural and political nationalists increasingly believed that the indoctrination of children was fundamental to any successful effort to transform Ireland into an independent state where Indigenous culture, language and traditions were predominant. For many, it simply made more sense to focus their energies on children rather than adults, and participation in Gaelic games was seen as a vital proselytizing vehicle. As one nationalist newspaper observed, and I quote, the boys of today will be the men of tomorrow, and it would not be natural to hope that boys indifferent to the manly sports of their race will, in the future, become patriotic citizens, men capable of any great efforts in the national cause. So, nationalist newspapers would soon begin to feed a torrent of propaganda which sought to instruct Irish children along patriotic lines. Now, the radical IRB mouthpiece, Irish Freedom, carried a dedicated children's column which was translated from Irish as the Sunroom of Youth, and it was written under the pseudonym of Nessa. Now, frequently NASA would run competitions inviting readers to submit short essays on a particular question or topic posed. So in response to the question, are Irish boys and girls justified in playing foreign games? The winning response declared, and I quote, native games are fitted for the temperament and physique of our people and belong to the national life and tradition of the Irish race. On the other hand, foreign pastimes have been forced upon us. They contaminate the minds of young people. They induce them to renounce home and patriotism and inspire some with contempt for their native land. And I think that kind of language begins to graphically illustrate the impact on some young minds of the increasingly intolerant rhetoric of the Irish Ireland ideology towards anything that was looked upon as un-Irish. Now, the Christian Brothers, meanwhile, were also becoming fearful of the apparent damaging influence on the nation's youth caused by the exposure to cheap English-produced weekly children's magazines, viewing them, of course, as manifestations of British imperial propaganda, which they saw as being deeply corrosive to the flowering patriotism of the next generation in Ireland. And so their response was an Irish alternative, whose material was more adapted to the needs of a Catholic nationalist audience. Thus, in September 1914, the first monthly issue of Our Boys magazine appeared. Now, this publication looked to seduce the hearts and minds of Irish children away from its British rivals by focusing on content which relied on a native frame of reference and drew heavy inspiration from Irish history and culture. Now, while it featured many staples of this genre of literature, you also had the likes of historical adventures set during key events in Ireland's past being predominant. So were opinion pieces which eulogized Ireland's Catholic heritage and the ideals of cultural nationalism and so on. Now, despite the Christian Brothers' earlier, often antagonistic relationship with the GAA, a magazine, of course, which sought to inspire children's devotion to Irish cultural supremacy, could ill afford to ignore such a visible expression of Irish cultural identity. And so, from October 1917, a dedicated Gaelic Games column appeared. Its author's stated aim was to, quote, plant firmly on our sod the games of the Gael, so long neglected by the boys of Ireland. And the column carried the likes of news and reports on major GAA events and games, as well as frequent accounts of the progress of youth competitions. It also devoted much space to the promotion of hurling, in particular, publicizing and explaining its rules, offering advice on developing the right skills and playing techniques, and giving practical guidance to boys organizing their own underage clubs. Hurling then was viewed as a perfect medium to encourage the native version of muscular Christianity emphasized by a Christian Brother education, while also being a conduit for advancing other major aspects of Irish culture. The magazine declared that there was no better way a young Gael could, quote, refresh the body and mind than the manly national game of hurling. Now, as Marnie Hay will speak about in more detail, the decades preceding Irish independence also witnessed the rise of a range of uniformed youth organisations. Many of these also sought to use sport as a means of proselytising Irish children for explicit political purposes. And of course, the most notable example of this impulse was the advent of Na Fianna Éireann. Yet, Na Fianna Éireann was only the largest of several nationalist youth organisations which now materialised in Ireland. For example, in 1911, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the AOH, which was a popular nationalist Catholic fraternity society closely aligned to the Irish Home Rule movement, created its own male youth body, the Hibernian Boys Brigade. The brigade was open to, quote, Catholic boys of Irish parentage aged between 10 and 17, and it promoted their, quote, physical and moral welfare. It also sought to develop what it calls, and I quote, boys' physical system to the extent necessary to enable them to successfully withstand the struggle of life in these strenuous times. And so, echoing the Fianna, their training also emphasized interaction and cultural nationalism, such as, quote, the study and practice of the Irish language, the promotion of Irish industries, and the study of Irish history. And this also included Gaelic games, and indeed by May 1913, the brigade had several Gaelic football teams affiliated to the Dublin GAA School League. Meanwhile, the appearance of nationalist youth movements targeted at boys encouraged the formation of female equivalents. By 1915, the Clan na Gael Girl Scouts organisation had become visible in the likes of Dublin and was also linked to the AOH. One recruitment notice declared it was much the duty of Irish girls to, quote, learn the art of war so as to be able to fight for your country as it is for boys. And aside from military instruction, the organisation's training included the study of Irish and, of course, the playing of camogie. So, in both these organisations, then, the encouragement of Gaelic games served the dual purpose of endorsing Irish cultural homogeny while fostering physical fitness. And so, to conclude, in the decades preceding Irish independence, you saw Irish children being exposed to organised sport in an unparalleled manner. Influenced by developments in mainland Britain, many Irish educationalists now saw in sport, they saw sport as an ideal medium to sculpt children's behaviour. Yet the increasing promotion of British games in Irish schools was also seen by many nationalists as another demonstration of Ireland's submergence within British cultural domination. But with the advent of the Gaelic revival and its most significant sporting manifestation, the GAA, nationalists now look to promote hurling and Gaelic football among the nation's youth, incorporating this into a larger campaign of culturally and politically preparing the next generation to take their place as the leaders of a new and hopefully politically and culturally independent Irish nation. And nationalist propaganda targeted at children played a prominent part in this enterprise. Meanwhile, the appearance of quasi-military youth groups in Ireland offered further opportunities to utilise sport as a method of political programming. Their encouragement of Gaelic games among their members was therefore part of a kind of holistic training of the future manhood and womanhood of Ireland. For many advocates then, sport became another means of awakening Ireland's youth to their nationalist fate, which was, of course, to lead the cultural and political struggle that would ultimately break British control of Ireland. And thank you very much for listening to my